We're back here live in Helsinki. We're covering all the truly stunning public comments by President Trump and Vladimir Putin at their summit here in Finland. After the summit, Putin sat down for an interview with Chris Wallace of Fox News and refused to even look at a copy of Robert Mueller's indictment charging a dozen members of the Russian military intelligence agency. Listen to this.
I have here the indictment that was presented on Friday from the special counsel Robert Mueller that says that 12 members of Russian military intelligence, the GRU, and they talk specifically about units 26-165 and 74-455. They say, you smile, let me finish. They say that these units were specifically involved in hacking into Democratic Party computers, stealing information, and spreading it to the world to try to disrupt the American election. May I give this to you to look at, sir? Here?
Да, положите, пожалуйста. Да. Значит, позвольте мне, отвечая на ваш вопрос, начать
start answering your question
с другого.
With something a little bit different.
Смотрите, все говорят о
Let's have a look at it this way.
вмешательстве России.
People are talking about the purported interference of Russia with the election process in the United States. I've mentioned this in 2016 and I want to say it now again. And I really wish for your American listeners to listen to what I say. First of all, Russia, as a state, has never interfered with the internal affairs of the United States, let alone its elections.
Phil Mudd, the President of the United States, seems to believe him.
Yeah, but I mean, I think we've been spending the past few hours talking about the sort of political aspects of this, what Vladimir Putin has said. I think it's worth for a moment making this a little more personal. I joined the service in 1985. At that point,
When you say the service?
The CIA. At that point, the service was the USSR, the Soviets, who were fomenting revolution everywhere from Southeast Asia to Africa to Latin America. When I left the service in 2010 and beyond, even going up today, my peers who still serve look at everything from the Novichok attacks in the UK to Vladimir Putin's support for a murderer in Syria. And I've talked to friends who've got 30-plus years in the past 2 weeks, 30-plus years, one of whom I met on the street a week ago, and he looked at me, put his life on the line in an al-Qaeda fight and said, why did I do it? Wolf, it's 1:52 a.m. Why don't you go downstairs after we get off the air in 8 minutes and explain to me over a drink why we did it, so that the president can say, I don't trust American intelligence, but I do trust the adversary that fomented revolution overseas in the favor of communism and that murdered people in the UK. That's why we did the service for 30 years. I don't get it, Wolf. It's not only political. There's personal aspects to this, the people who served in the business. It's painful.
And you heard Rick Legend. He spent almost 30 years at the National Security Agency, the U.S. intelligence community. You spent almost 30 years in the U.S. Navy, became an admiral. How do you feel about all
the
this?
Same way Phil does. I mean, look, 30 years, and I sailed in the Baltic Sea not far from here. In 1988, my first deployment at sea, chasing Soviet submarines. They were the threat. And Russia still is the threat. For the last 10 years in particular, it makes NATO even more relevant than it was now. And so when I listen to the commander-in-chief get up there today and take the side of the Russian president against his own intelligence community and the national security establishment, I think that's a disgrace. As commander-in-chief, I'm absolutely shocked by it.
For both of you, Phil, this is emotional for you.
It is. I mean, you look back and when you join, you have friends who join and become accountants, they become bankers, they become lawyers, and they make a heck of a lot of money. And you go to work every day and you say, you know, we have a higher cause. We have a cause to protect things that we think are of value in this country, the freedom of speech, freedom of democracy. Forget about economics. Forget about whether the EU is or is not an economic foe. We have a rival, an adversary in Russia who does not respect the rule of law, doesn't respect democratic opposition, and doesn't respect the freedom of the press. And the president says, I like him better than I like the EU, and his meeting's easier than my meeting with Theresa May. I don't get it, Wolf. That's not why I did 25 years.
Attacks our country through cyber, supports the Taliban in Afghanistan. If you don't think that there have been American lives put at risk, if not taken, through the results of Russian interference in the world, think again. What they're supporting Assad against the Syrian Democratic Forces and the opposition, and their continued coddling of Iran and Iran's malign influence in the region. All of that leads to huge national security threats. And again, our commander-in-chief stood up there today and basically wrapped his arms around what is indisputably an American enemy.
And it's interesting, everything we're hearing, Caitlin, and you're well plugged into this, the White House simply doesn't know how to respond to all of this.
They don't. And there have been so many crises of the administration's own making throughout Donald Trump's time in office. But this is one time today where I called several people who worked in this White House, not low-level staffers, very senior officials, and they simply didn't know what to say. They were speechless. The ones who were traveling with the president got with him on Air Force One, turned their phones off for that 8.5-hour flight back, and the rest of them were left to really clean up with what President Trump had just said. Welcoming someone who attacked an American election in front of everyone, in front of these cameras on television. And for once, they simply weren't able to spin this or frame this in a way that was favorable for the administration. They simply had nothing to say about what the president had said at that press conference, and they were just as stunned as we were. And one of them, I asked them, do you think people are going to resign over this, including, potentially Dan Coates or John Bolton or someone like that, who has previously said very critical things about Russia interfering in the election? They said that was a good question, but they couldn't answer it.
We'll see what happens on that front. Stick around. I want to bring in Fareed Zakaria, the host of Fareed Zakaria GPS, who's joining us. Fareed, what's your reaction to what we all heard today from the President of the United States?
Well, look, for all those who wondered whether Donald Trump would at some point normalize, whether he would somehow get reined in by the strictures and constraints of the presidency, of the White House, of listening to those daily presidential briefings, we've had ample evidence to say it, but here is the most final, conclusive evidence. The answer is no. Donald Trump is as bizarre a candidate as we have ever had in American history, and he has turned the political world topsy-turvy. He has taken a party that used to be deeply anti-Russian, pro-CIA, pro-free trade, and pro-immigrant under Ronald Reagan, and reversed course on all of those things. And what is striking is there is really no opposition within his party. Think about this. Mitt Romney, the presidential nominee of the same party, when campaigning against Barack Obama, and this was the last presidential election before Donald Trump, said the biggest problem with the Obama administration is they are not tough enough on our single greatest geopolitical adversary, Russia and Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump has essentially taken the polar opposite position, and the entire Republican establishment, all these storied intellectuals and policy wonks who have had high-level positions, they've all just fallen in line.
It's interesting. The former CIA director, John Brennan, said it was treasonous what the president is doing and saying right now. Is that too much?
Well, I don't know how do you judge Donald Trump by, if you use any normal metric, he sort of overshoots it in so many directions that you don't know whether to laugh or cry, right? I mean, think about Jane Fonda was regarded as having been engaged in treasonous behavior because she was in a photo op in a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft missile. Here you have the President of the United States saying that he supports Vladimir Putin's version of events, saying why would they interfere when there is, of course, not just evidence, but clear intent. We know everything about why Putin hated Hillary Clinton. He saw Hillary Clinton as having tried to support the pro-democracy movement in Russia during his re-election bid for the presidency, and therefore had this personal grudge against her. We know that he has used these kind of operations in Ukraine, in other European countries. So this is not just U.S. intelligence. There are multiple intelligence agencies from across the Western world. The pattern is the same. The motive is clear. And yet you have the president saying, I believe the adversary. I don't believe our own government, the government he heads, his own director of national intelligence. Yes, but it almost feels like treasonous is too weak a word, because the whole thing has taken on an air of such unreality that you don't even know what standards to apply to somebody like Donald Trump. The really interesting question, though, is will there be any blowback? Will there be, will the kind of things you're describing when you were talking about with the panel, will it matter? Will it matter to the Republican establishment? Will it matter to senators? Will it matter to the party? And will it most importantly matter in his approval ratings within the party? Remember, Donald Trump is still, at last polls taken, more popular among Republicans than any Republican president in recorded history. That includes George W. Bush the week after 9/11. Is that going to change?